Hi, this is Rabbi Law, and this is Parsha of the Week. The Parsha this week is Parsha Shelach, Sending. And this lecture is called The Spies, the Enlightenment, and Orthodox Anti-Zionism. Should be a juicy topic and get you thinking today. So the Meraglim, the spies, we find in this Parsha Shelach, is one of the most difficult parts of the Tanakh to really understand. The Jews had left Egypt through mighty miracles. God had given them incredible situation in the desert. They had received the Torah. They had become a nation at the covenant, which they made when they received the Torah at Sinai. Before that, they had the splitting of the sea. And here in the Parsha, and throughout really the book of Bamidbar, we see all sorts of problems start to arise of this people who were becoming something new. They had been slaves before, and now they received the Torah, and they were told that they were going to enter this land. And this land wasn't just going to be an uninhabited land. It was going to be a land full of people who wanted to destroy them, the Canaanites. The land had been promised to them by Hashem to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. And these are the direct descendants of them. And God had told them, go in and conquer this land and take out the nations, the Canaanite nations that were going to be there. But they had also been living easy, so to speak. First of all, they had had a slave mentality from when they were in Egypt, which certainly was not easy. But then they went to the opposite extreme. They received the spiritual light of the Torah, as well as they had food provided them from the man, this heavenly food that would come down every day. And they had water that would go along in the Be'er Shel Miriam. And their clothes would never wear out. They were being guided by pillars of fire and smoke. And God sent these amazing leaders, led by Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron and others, who led them in the desert. They received holy Torah. Their life was one of affluence and material spirituality, yet they were still stuck in somewhat of a slave mentality. So we read in the Parsha, it starts like this. V'diber Adonai el Moshe, lemor, Shelach lecha anashim v'yasuru es eretz Kanaan asher ani nosen levnei Yisrael ish echad l'matei avosav tishlachu kol nasi v'hem. God said to Moshe to say, send for yourselves men, distinguished, and tour out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, one man from each tribe of their fathers. You shall send the princes in them. So we see here that God told them to go and do this mission. Now, according to most commentators, the mission was just to go out and check out the situation in the land. We see that Moshe told them, this is what he told them later on here, after they picked the 12 different spies. He said, spy out the land of Canaan and say to them, ascend here in the south and climb the mountain. See the land, how is it? And the people that dwell in it. Is it strong or weak? Is it few or numerous? And how is the land in which it dwells? Is it good or is it bad? And how are the cities in which it dwells? Are they open or are they fortified? And how is the land? Is it fertile or is it lean? Are there trees in it or not? You shall strengthen yourselves and take from the fruit of the land. So we see here that the land was not totally known what it was going to be like. None of the people who had lived in the land, the sons of Yaakov, were still alive. People didn't know the land. So they were going to go out to enter as a large nation. And they needed to know both militarily and economically what the situation was going to be. To split up the land among the tribes eventually, so they had to know where was good and where was bad. And they also needed to know militarily where they were going to enter and where they were going to wage their war and what was the nature of the enemy. And as we know, 10 of the 12 spies brought back a bad report. The land was too strong, there were giants in it, and they felt very small, and that they knew we didn't have a chance. And they brought this bad report to the people. And Moshe was very upset about it, or he fell down. But 2 of the spies had very good news. And they said, no, this is not true, we can do this. That was Yeshua and Caleb. Those 2 spies were not like the others. And they went against the majority, and they said, no, this is good. We can go in. So what was going on? There's many different explanations of why they were disheartened. Some of the explanations include, again, the slave mentality, etc. But the explanation which I'm going to deal with today in order to speak about my main topic, which is the Enlightenment and Orthodox Anti-Zionism, is a very famous Zohar on page 158a in the 3rd section of the Zohar. And this is what it says. It says, V'yishlach osam Moshe, kulam anashim. Moshe sent them. They were all men. The word anashim in the Torah always indicates they were great levels. They're not called Bnei Adam or Adam. They're called Anashim. This is a level of very high-level men. As a matter of fact, they were Nasim. They were like princes of the tribe. These are the highest-level people. People tend to look at the Torah and think that the people in the Torah that make mistakes, like the Spies or Korach, were Rishayim, were evil people with evil intentions and easy to pick out. But the Holy Sfarim say this isn't so. As a matter of fact, Reb Simcha Bunim Pesishcha says that people think Esau is this wild barbarian type guy. He was hairy, he was angry, it was so easy to see who he was. And the obvious question would be, for Esau, how could it be that someone like that would fool a great tzaddik like Yitzhak? So Reb Simcha Bunim Pesishcha says, you have to understand that Esau wore white clothes and a bekasher and a strimel and gave over a divrei Torah at the third meal. Esau was not just this wild, crazy guy. He was someone who on the appearances looked to be a tzaddik. So too the people here in Shelach. The Zohar is saying the spies were anashim. That's actually the word exactly it says in the Torah. They were a high-level person. They were all righteous, it says. Kulu zakin havu, the Zohar says. V'reisha Yisrael havu. They were the leaders of Israel. It says, but they took for themselves a bad advice. Aval inun dibrug the garmehu ita bisha. Amai natal itada. Why did they take this bad advice, the Zohar says? Why did they take this wrong path, these leaders, tzadikim? Eva amru iye'ilu Yisrael la'ara. If we enter the land of Israel, nis avar anun milemei rishim. We won't be leaders anymore. Meaning is it's known for those who go to Eretz Yisrael that you have to be an extra level of greatness. The reason it's called the land of Canaan is Canaan means humble. You must be humiliated. You must be lowered when you go to there. You don't have the opportunity like you do in the diaspora in Eretz Yisrael to be this huge person. It's a higher level. It's like you're competing against the best. It's like competing in high school sports and then going to university or pro sports. It's a whole different level. And these guys were great leaders, but they knew that they didn't have what it takes to cut it in the land of Israel. And they were comfortable. They had materialism. They had abundance in the land of Chutz Haaretz. They were doing fine out there. Why should they change things? All we have to do is hold on to the Torah of our fathers and we'll be okay. We're learning Torah, we're tzaddikim, we're leaders. Why would we want to give that up? Well, the answer is because that's what God wants from us. They didn't want to go into the land of Israel because they knew that they wouldn't be as high level there. And they would have to humble themselves and be like a regular person. When you go to Israel, you see there are people there, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, who have incredible level of knowledge. You see simple men fixing the sandals who are great tzaddikim, who know all the Torah. It's a whole different level there. You need a level of emunah. You need a level of great connection, devekus, and love, just to be a regular person there, not some big rabbi. So it says here, Yiminu Moshe Reshin Achrin. Moshe is going to set up other leaders. When you go to Eretz Yisrael, it's going to be a completely different leadership there. Why is that? Well, we know that Moshe himself eventually wasn't going to be able to go to the land of Israel. And the explanation that I heard that makes sense to me about why Moshe wasn't able to go to the land was that a new type of Jew needed to be created. The type of Jew that didn't just receive Torah and man from heaven, the type of Jew that would work the land, who would use his body physically to go and become part of the land, to humble himself, to use his fingers to do more than just turn the pages, but to wield a gun or wield a shovel, to make something new. And these guys weren't willing to do it. In the level of the ivory tower Torah, they were the highest, but they weren't willing to move into the level of just being with the regular people to build something new. That was what their mistake was. As a matter of fact, even Moshe Rabbeinu, though he wasn't thinking like this, nevertheless, it was not good for the people for Moshe Rabbeinu to continue on in the land. Because if Moshe went into the land, it would be the same thing. It would be this very hierarchical, top-down type of situation. And they needed a leader who was going to go there and fight as a warrior, a leader like Yeshua. Moshe Rabbeinu was the level of the Torah, the law bringer. They needed a different type of Torah, a type of Torah of the legs, of the feet, of the hands, of the weapon, of taking up a gun and fighting against our enemies. That's why Yeshua was the level for the next generation. It's not in any way a denigration of Moshe. Moshe was the highest level, but he was the highest level for his time. He wasn't the Rebbe for the next generation, right? And this is why the Zohar says these spies took this bad advice for themselves. And that's why they died. They weren't willing to follow the advice of the times, that it was time for a new generation, a new thing. Right? Okay. Now I want to speak about the Enlightenment and Orthodox Anti-Zionism. It's a passionate topic. So the question remains today, why is it that so many great people do not promote living in the Eretz Israel, do not promote Aliyah, and are very happy to continue in existence in Chutz Haaretz? So let's talk a little bit about how the Enlightenment happened. Enlightenment, in the Hebrew Haskalah, was a movement in Europe. And I'm looking now at the Encyclopedia Britannica. This is what it says. The dates of the Enlightenment was 1601 through about 1800. It was an extremely important movement in the development of Western thought. And as the Jews, the leaders, the ones who would eventually become the generations of the Zionists and anti-Zionists in Europe, they were all extremely influenced by what was going on at the time. I want to also give thanks to my professor, Professor Ken Green, who I learned something about this time period, the question of freedom in Judaism, in my course, History of Modern Jewish Thought, at the University of Toronto last semester. So this is what the Encyclopedia Britannica says about the Enlightenment, the Haskalah. 1601 through 1800, location Europe. The causes, methods and ways of thinking developed during the scientific revolution of the 15th through 17th centuries. Renaissance humanism, which rediscovered classical literature and culture. The Reformation and its undermining of the Roman Catholic Church authority. So basically, people started thinking differently. People like Descartes, Copernicus, Galileo, they started questioning the scientific model that had been before. Also, in the Renaissance, which is right before this, people started rediscovering the classics of Greek and Roman thought, which really, a lot of it was built on rationalism and philosophy, whereas for the Dark Ages, in between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, everything had basically been taken over by the Catholic churches' approach to things, which was based purely on what their view of salvation, and science took a secondary place, and reason took a secondary place. At this time, things started changing in Europe, and people started thinking about things using science and rationalism. And they took great opposition from the church for doing this. It wasn't exactly an easy thing for this to happen. This also led to Martin Luther and his Reformation. So this is the outcomes according to Encyclopedia Britannica. The outcomes were the understanding of the universe as a mechanism governed by discoverable laws, the belief that human history is a record of progress. This is the idea of progressiveness, of progression, that things are getting better, that technology and human thought is getting better. It's not looking back to the past as in Judaism and also other religions. Look back to the past as the ideal time. The Enlightenment believed that the future is getting better. And then it says that Romanticism in the late 18th century, the first modern secularized theories of psychology and ethics. Before this, psychology and ethics was purely linked to religion. The idea of society as a social contract, the use and celebration of reason. But this had this incredible impact throughout the whole world, particularly in Europe, and that eventually spread to Eastern Europe as well. Anyway, people started to change, and this had a great effect on Jews, particularly in Germany, in France, and eventually other places. Jews who had suddenly been, basically subject people for a long, long, long time, now had the potential to become free. This was started really by the American and French revolutions, and of course Napoleon's decree to emancipate the Jews, that the Jews were now going to be free, they were going to be like everybody else, the great humanism of the time. Now the rabbis at the time, there's a big argument about whether it would be good for the Jews to be emancipated or not. With one side saying emancipation is good, how can freedom be worse than being a subject people? And we know all the horrible pogroms and things that happened. And the other side said, listen, the Jews do best under a state of pressure, under some sort of oppression. That both of these ideas actually had its flaws. One was the idea that this progress, that the Enlightenment was going to lead to a wonderful society. This was already criticized back in the time of Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard. He already said this idea that the Enlightenment of secular humanism, that everything could be figured out with science, this is already going to lead us to bad things. And he predicted, in a way, all the abuses of World War II and the Holocaust, etc. And also, the other side was right. That the idea that if we don't have pressure upon us, things were going to be really bad for us. We look here in the Western world, we look in the United States, for instance, and 80% of the Jewish people are basically intermarrying and disappearing. And it's gone down to the small intellectual elite. And that's sort of what's left, really. The only way to guarantee that your children are going to be Jewish and your grandchildren by being Orthodox. But I'm just saying statistically. Okay. So let's get that into Haskalah and Zionism. Now, the Jews were always quite a few steps behind everything. So when things were opened up and the Jews were emancipated, though it certainly wasn't that simple, there was still an incredible amount of anti-Semitism as viewed by the Alfred Dreyfus affair in France, which, by the way, was the turning point for Herzl's Zionism. People were jumping to get to be emancipated. And they were living in a society where suddenly everything was free and everything was open to them in theory, not always. But it seemed like that. Now, it all happened too quickly. Suddenly the Jews were free after basically living as a subject people under Christendom for 1,000 years or longer. And it wasn't so simple to make that transition. So a lot of Jews just transformed overnight and basically became enlightened. Either they became part of the Christian majority, or they became secular, or they just became extremely modern. And because the Jews were behind, the traditional Jews we call Orthodox today, or ultra-Orthodox, or Haredi, you have to understand why they didn't like these guys. Imagine you're this person who loves Torah, you love Judaism, that's your whole identity. You don't really have any part of the rest of your society, your life in the greater circles of Europe. And everything that's so important to you is Judaism. And then this Jew comes along, and maybe he's clean-shaven, he doesn't wear a yarmulke, doesn't keep Shabbos. He's talking about all these philosophies, these foreign philosophies about science. How are you going to react? They didn't react well. Let's put it that way. And the Haskalah was seen as a very big opponent. So you have to look at things from both sides. If you're an ultra-Orthodox person, you're a regular Jew, which everyone was basically ultra-Orthodox, whatever that term means, Haredi. And these guys come along, these Jews who don't have any of this, who don't have Torah, who don't keep Shabbos, they come along. Why do you want to be connected to these people? You don't. And if you are a secular, enlightened Jew or enlightened, religious Jew, why do you want to become like these old guys? What do you want to do with them? Suddenly, everything's open to you. Why would you want to be enslaved and act like your subject when you're not anymore? You want to be free. You want to be enlightened. You want to open yourself to the open, wide world of culture. So you can see where the problem started. And this is where Zionism comes in Orthodox anti-Zionism. Is that I believe that the ideology of anti-Zionism is certainly not found directly in the Torah, and it was an ideology developed by thinkers who were emotionally disturbed by what they perceived Zionists to be. So that's what Theodor Herzl, for instance. Theodor Herzl grew up in a totally assimilated house without any really semblance of Judaism, but he had a strong Jewish culture. And his turning point was the anti-Semitism in Europe. People have to understand Zionism in Israel did not just come out of nowhere. It came out of anti-Semitism. It came out of nationalism. It came out of all the current ideas, the things that were happening in Europe. And we know it was not time for Jews to be in Europe anymore. Looking back in history, what happened? I mean, first of all the pogroms that happened. But after that, the Holocaust. That Enlightenment was not the solution to fix the spiritual and physical problems of the Jews, but it was a start to be able to get us to have the political power in order to do something. And this charismatic leader, Herzl, came along, and he was so affected by anti-Semitism of the Alfred Dreyfus affair in France that he propelled the Zionist movement forward as a political movement. And they made the Zionist Congress. But again, let's go back to these ultra-Orthodox Jews. The rabbis, the Gedolim, the people who saw people like Herzl, and Ahad Ha'am, who was once religious and left that behind. Other leaders like this, they saw these guys. What do they want to do with these guys? Are you going to listen to these guys? And of course, I believe they were incorrect in doing so, but it makes sense sociologically of why these two parties wouldn't want anything to do with each other. If you're an enlightened person, even nowadays, you're an enlightened person, you're a modern person, what do you want to have to do with these, guys with long beards and black coats and they look like they live in some past? God forbid if you think that I'm thinking like that. I'm just trying to explain to you the perspective of what these secular enlightened Jews, and that's the way they grew up. They grew up that way in Germany or France. It's not like all of them decided that. There's some exceptions like Ahad Ha'am, people like that, people who change their mind. But that also could be argued like if everyone around them is giving it up, it's very, very hard. It's sort of like religious Jews who go to the Israeli army. Some of them do give it up if they're young because the pressure of society causes you to do it. We have to judge people favorably. My belief is that Orthodox anti-Zionism does not have a solid foundation in the Torah. Really, if you look at this parsha Shelach, we see that it's the opposite, that we need to have a emunah to go into the land of Eretz Yisrael. And the Jews who were Zionists who founded this, they were good people with good intentions. So a lot of people will turn back and say, well, what about Das Torah? Well, these were also Das Torah. I read you the Zohar. They were leaders, they were Gedolim, they were Tzaddikim. Das Torah can be wrong. It can be wrong. It's that simple. There's many examples of that in the Torah. Besides here, we have to understand that Korach and other people like that, they were leaders. They were great people. But they made a mistake. But what's interesting here is that 2 of the 12 spies had it right. So people say, well, the Zionist rabbis and stuff, they're very small. Well, was 1 out of 6 a good number? Maybe 1 out of 6. The Torah is full of mistakes by great people, and we learn from their mistakes. The problem is we're not living with the times. As I said, my main problem with anti-Zionism, I have to admit, is coming from a heart place. We look at the Tanakh, and there are a few periods, the early part of the Hanukkah story, and certainly King David and King Shlomo, but the rest of the time, the leaders of Tanakh, they weren't always the greatest guys. They weren't so religious. They were sometimes even bad people. Just because the leaders and the Medina isn't the way that you want it to look, doesn't mean that it's not what God wants. Doesn't mean that it's not a holy thing. Right? The Jews and the story of Eretz Yisrael is a story of the whole people. Not an elite small group. Not just a few. It's the whole people. And Zionism was the thing that brought the whole people from the brink of destruction and saved whoever was able to get to Europe, out of Europe, to Israel. And maybe it's a minority of rabbis, but those rabbis had a vision. They saw something, the future of Eretz Yisrael. And the anti-Zionism, it's not coming from a place of Torah. It's coming from a place of emotion, of disgust with what they perceive the Maskilim and what they perceive the Zionists, the Enlightened to be. And you also have to understand why this is so. Again, if you're enlightened or you're a Zionist and you saw these ultra-religious guys and you're living in a cultured place like Germany or France or even nowadays in America and Canada and England, why do you want to become part of something from the past? You got to be living in the current. That's what they were thinking. So it's a sociological thing. And people's Torah, I want to say, comes from their sociological position of what they feel, what they want. That's how anti-Zionism developed in the Orthodox community. It's just a lack of vision to see that the history of Israel isn't always a history of tzaddikim. It's a history of a people that goes through ups and downs. In Egypt, out of Egypt, Galus, back to Eretz Yisrael. It's not a history where everything is perfect and pure, like the Jews, the spies wanted to do. They wanted to live in Moshe Rabbeinu's Torah forever, and the man falling from heaven, and the next level had to be Jews who would fight, who would take up the spade and build houses and go to war with their hands. And that's the level that is required from us. The time for anti-Zionism is gone. It's now time to embrace the fact that Israel is our future. Eretz Yisrael is our home, and that's where we're going. This is the beginning. We will build it. It's not a magical thing that's just going to fall from heaven. If we can't see the miracles in the everyday, can't see the miracles of history, the miracles of the building of Eretz Yisrael, I'm afraid our Judaism has stopped a long time ago. What Judaism stopped in the time of the giving of the Torah, the time of the desert, it didn't exist in the Tanakh. It stopped when the Gemara was written. It stopped when Kabbalah came out. It stopped when Hasidus came out. No. Any Jew who wants to stop in that time period, I'm just going to learn Hasidus, I'm just going to learn Gemara, I'm just going to... No. Revelation, God's will is being continually revealed all the time. We have to understand that when the Baal Shem Tov came along, he taught the world the amazing teaching that God is everywhere. But the next generation is the level of Eretz Yisrael. And not only see God everywhere, but return with their feet. It's the Torah of the feet and the hands, and to see the holiness of the everyday Jew building the land. It's not an elite Judaism for the select few who stay Jewish out here in the diaspora. The future is Eretz Yisrael. That's the gift that God gave us. Let's see revelation continually happening in front of us and what's happening today. This is Rabbi Law, and this is Parsha Shelach, the Spies, the Enlightenment, and Orthodox Anti-Zionism. Thank you for watching.